So, hi everyone, welcome to this week's talk, and today I'm going to take you through an introduction of Thyreophora. So just briefly, through this talk, I'm going to introduce the clade, then provide characteristics of each individual groups within Thyreophora as well. I will highlight different genera which I think are relevant one way or another, and then I'll end this talk with examples of some recent research which have added to our understanding of Thyreophorian groups. So I've used that term multiple times now, but what actually is Thyreophora? Basically, Thyreophora is a clade of ornithischian dinosaurs. And they tend to be armoured and have tails weapons one way or another. And Thyreophora itself is, again, broken down into several different groups. For the purpose of this lecture, we'll break it down into 4 groups: the basal Thyreophorians, the Stegosaurs, the Ankylosaurs, and the Nodosaurs. And so the basic principal characteristics of Thyreophora is that they tend to be armoured with osteoderm bone armour, one way or another. They tend to be heavy and very large animals that are almost exclusively quadrupedal. Generally speaking, they're thought to be relatively slow-moving animals, but they have weaponized tails and clubs and spikes. And so we'll start breaking down the basal, or the early members of Thyreophora. And we'll start with Scutellosaurus, which means little shield lizard. Scutellosaurus was discovered in Arizona, USA, around 160 million years old. And this guy is very small for a Thyreophorian dinosaur. He's only 1.3 meters, which is, you'll see in a minute, tiny compared to his cousins. And he's most likely the earliest Thyreophorian dinosaur we actually have. And the key characteristic of Scutellosaurus is that he is bipedal, which means he only walks on his hind legs, which is interesting considering that the rest of Thyreophora, generally speaking, is quadrupedal, walking on all fours. So it implies that the group started bipedal and then became quadrupedal later on. The next basal member I want to point out is a more recent discovery. This is Jacopil from Argentina. He was discovered in 2022 and, again, is very small for a Thyreophorian dinosaur. He's estimated to be around 1.5 meters length and only 7 kilograms in weight, which is a far cry from the several ton animals I'll show you in a minute. So, Jacopil is interesting because despite the limited amount of material we actually have on Jacopil, it seems to have demonstrated characteristics that both stegosaurs and ankylosaurs have. He has the classic osteoderm bone armour of ankylosaurs, but its skull is more narrow and ends in a beak like its stegosaurs. And so the final basal member of Thyreophora I want to talk about is Scelidosaurus. This was found in Charmouth in the 1800s and was named by Richard Owen in 1861. And lived during the Early Jurassic 193 million years ago and is around 4 meters in length, significantly larger than the 2 previous basal members. It's also worth noting that Scelidosaurus appears to demonstrate when the group started to become quadrupedal, but still was supposedly faster than most of the heavier setted animals later on. And so we'll move on to the next group, the stegosaurs. These are one of the most famous dinosaurs in history. Most people could at least recognize Stegosaurus from a picture. But they are generally characterized by being from the Middle Jurassic to the Early Cretaceous in age, found pretty much everywhere in the world, but mostly USA and North America and Asia. And stegosaurs are characterized by those back plates that they are famous for, and almost also having spikes on their tails, which have unofficially been labeled as thagomisers. It's also worth noting that stegosaurs have really flexible tail compared to pretty much every other dinosaur group, able to swing their tails to almost to the shoulders, around 270 degrees of rotation. Really flexible tails. Also, their skulls are very interesting. They seem to end in a beak-like structure, similar to turtles and birds. And their head skulls tend to be narrower compared to the ankylosaurs. It's also worth noting that those skulls are tiny for their body size, which unfortunately for them means that they had very small brain cases, implying that they weren't the brightest of dinosaurs around. But of course, looking at the more famous things they're known for, those tail spikes and those back planes, is that they come in a wide range of shapes and sizes. And it's hard to tell what those plates were for. The tails are obvious. It's a form of defense from predators, trying to skew or even deter predators that try and attack the stegosaur. But the actual plate themselves have a couple of theories what they might be used for. Some speculated originally that it was a form of defense, but it's not been as effectively accepted nowadays. So the current two theories that people look at is that it was for thermoregulation, helping the stegosaurs cool off and heat up in their environments. But it also could be as a form of display, helping them communicate with individuals within the group. It's hard to say for now, but those are good ideas. And so the first stegosaur I want to discuss is Thyreophora from Asia, southern western China. It was discovered in 1974 and described in 1997. Thyreophora was around about 150, 154, 157 million years ago, and was significantly larger than the basal thyreophorians, weighing 7 meters in length and 1.5 tons. But what's interesting about Thyreophora is that the back plates are far pointier than compared to Stegosaurus. They're almost spike-like. And the reason why that is not really well known. But perhaps it actually could have been more of a defensive style of having back plates compared to Stegosaurus. Next, we have a really bizarre stegosaur. This is called Kentrosaurus, the spiky lizard. It lived in the late Jurassic 152 million years ago in Africa and was described in 1915. What's bizarre about Kentrosaurus is that it had both plates and spikes, the front half having plates and the rear half having spikes. And the tail itself had a massive range of movement, able to reaching its head in some cases. But relatively small. It's a relatively small stegosaur, only being 5 meters compared to Thyreophorus' 7. And this has caused it to have different solutions for feeding and defense. And those back spikes do help with that. As you can see, they run all the way up the tail, so they form a sort of barrier, similar to what a porcupine might do. It might turn to the rear to present the spikes to the predators. It's also noticing that a study here at the bottom right from Mallison in 2010 found that Kentrosaurus had a really flexible hip structure for a stegosaur, which helped him imply the theory that it could have come up in the hind leg. So despite being smaller, was still able to reach the same amount of vegetation as its larger cousins. So next up we have Hesperosaurus, the western lizard, who was found in Montana and Wyoming in 1985. He lived during the Jurassic 156 million years ago. And the osteoderms on the back, those plates, are actually looking more closely related to Stegosaurus. Rather than being pointier or spikes, they are now plates. And those plates ran asymmetrically, almost alternating down the back. It's also one of the largest stegosaurs, being 6 meters, so just slightly shy of Thyreophorus, but certainly larger than Kentrosaurus. As what else is interesting about Hesperosaurus is that the tail spikes in themselves. At the end of the tail, they are pointing out horizontally rather than vertically. Why that is, it's hard to say. Maybe it's a special kind of predator it was dealing with, or perhaps it was just two solutions to the same problem. And finally, if we're going to talk about stegosaurs, we should talk about Stegosaurus. It's hard to distinguish exactly when it was first discovered because of a time known as the Bone Wars, which we'll go into. That's a lecture in itself. But records are sort of hinting that around 1877 it was first discovered. And when it was first discovered, they thought the backplates formed a turtle shell, which meant they thought this was a turtle. But thankfully nowadays we can definitely see that it is not a turtle, that is definitely a dinosaur. And the bones are found all over America, in Yale, Colorado, and Wyoming. Now, Stegosaurus itself is actually one of the largest stegosaurs, pushing towards 9 meters in length, and the plates themselves are 60 centimeters. Massive. And Stegosaurus is found with many other famous dinosaurs, predominantly the predatory theropod Allosaurus. And we can see them interacting in this picture in the bottom right here. This is a Stegosaurus spike piercing through an Allosaurus backbone at the vertebrae. And this was an amazing find from Carpenter in 2004 because it showed just how powerful these tails can actually be. That spike went straight through the skin, the muscle, and then straight through the bone of an Allosaurus. An Allosaurus itself is not a small dinosaur. So, really impressive. So moving on then, we'll go on from Stegosaurs. We're now going to look at Ankylosauria. Ankylosauria itself is broken down into two groups, Ankylosauridae and Nodosauridae. So first up, we'll look at the Ankylosaurids, my personal favourite group of dinosaurs. Try not to be too biased. So Ankylosaurs tend to have very broad, low-lying bodies, with a wider stance compared to their stegosaurs, who are certainly more upright in nature. They have relatively larger and broader heads, and the osteoderm armour forms nodules rather than plates. And of course, the tails themselves, they are more fused at the end and semi-flexible, nowhere near as flexible as stegosaur tails though. And most of the species at the end have a tail club, sort of hammer shape. And this club has had a lot of research looked at. We looked at flexibility and also just the amount of muscle mass that would be needed. The reason why there's so much research into this is because tail clubs in nature are extremely rare. There's only two groups of animals that actually have them, ankylosaurs and a relative to armadillos called glyptodonts. But from these studies, we can definitely see that the ankylosaur tails were extremely effective at one thing, which was shattering bone. It could easily break a tibia or a femur. So the first ankylosaur I want to talk about is an ankylosaur from Canada, Euoplocephalus. So like all other ankylosaurs, the skull had a more broad muzzle-like shape. And it's one of the larger ankylosaurs, about 7 meters in length, and estimates putting it at 2 tons. However, it's worth noting that its tail club and the osteoderms are actually a lot lighter and smaller compared to its cousins, which led some people to speculate it could possibly have trotted like a rhinoceros if it needed to. So next up, we have the most recent ankylosaur in my talk. This is Zool, which was named after a Ghostbusters villain, I believe. I'm not too familiar. And was also found in Canada. So when Zool was first discovered, they actually thought it was a Euoplocephalus species. But they found that quite quickly that it was a new genre completely when they looked at the tail. Zool is one of the few ankylosaurs and the only Western ankylosaur to have osteoderm spikes running down the side of the tail, which gave it the nickname the Destroyer of Shins. Zool itself was about 6 meters in length, and the head was larger but flatter than most other ankylosaurs. Next up, we have a really special ankylosaur here. This is called Pinacosaurus, the plank lizard. It was discovered in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia about 1923, and it lived in the late Cretaceous, 81 to 75 million years ago. It was a medium-sized ankylosaur, which was a lot lighter in build, had smaller osteoderms and a tail club than most of her cousins. The estimates put it as about 5 meters in length and just shy or just slightly ahead of a ton. But the reason why Pinacosaurus is so important was because in 2022, one specimen was found with a fossilized larynx, which is a fossilized voice box. Now, this is extremely important because this tells us how they could possibly have communicated. And the study found that the voice box was more bird-like in nature as opposed closer to crocodiles and other reptiles, which meant it had a much broader range of vocalizations it could have made. It's also nice to note that that's one of the oldest examples of voice boxes ever preserved in the fossil record. And finally, we'll finish off by talking about Ankylosaurus, the fused lizard. It's arguably the most infamous ankylosaur, giving the group its namesake. So it was discovered in 1906 and was named in 1908, and it lived right up to the mass extinction event 66 million years ago. So estimations for length put it around 8 meters in length, and for weight it's tricky because Ankylosaur is certainly the largest and has more osteoderms. But the most I've seen is about 8 tons, which is an incredibly heavy animal and significantly heavier than most other animals in the talk. So it's interesting to look at the skull of Ankylosaurus because unlike the other Ankylosaurs, Ankylosaurus' nostrils point out sideways rather than front facing. And why this might be is still up to debate, but the best theory that has come forward is that because the skull itself was prioritizing armor and still needed to find a way to make the nose still breathe. And the skull itself is massive. It's 60 centimeters long and about 75 centimeters wide. And this sort of squared off jaw-like structure means that it was more of a generalist eater, but just eating what it could where it could. And so next we'll talk about the last group of dinosaurs, the nodosaurs. These guys are very similar to ankylosaurs, but they have a few key differences. So the main difference is that they don't have tail clubs, and the tails are less fused, but still have some fuse, and they still have their osteoderm armor. Nodosaurs themselves range from the late Jurassic to the late Cretaceous, and are found all over the world, predominantly in North America, Europe, and Asia. It's also worth noting that nodosaurs tend to have narrower skulls compared to that of ankylosaurs, and we'll go over why that's important in a little bit. So the first nodosaur I want to talk about is Sauropelta, the lizard shield. It was discovered in 1917 in Wyoming, Montana, and lived until the early Cretaceous around 100 million years ago. And Sauropelta was around 6.5 meters in length, and it had these large spikes on the shoulders and neck, likely making a defensive front-facing. It's also worth noting that Sauropelta had an incredibly long tail. Why that is, I'm not entirely sure. It could be possible that it was to help counterbalance the front heavy defenses, but it's hard to say. But it certainly would have needed those defenses because it lived with predators such as Dinocaris and Acrocanthosaurus, big theropod dinosaurs which easily would like to make a meal out of Sauropelta. Next up, we have the group's namesakes, Nodosaurus, the knobbed lizard. It was discovered in 1889 in Wyoming and lived at a very similar time, around that 100 million year ago mark, 99, maybe even 96 million years ago. And the problem is that Nodosaurus, unfortunately, doesn't have that much remains. There's not two great fossils found of it, which meant that making size and weight estimates quite difficult for Nodosaurus itself. But the most recent I've seen is about 5 meters in length. And again, that narrower skull compared to ankylosaurs meant that it could have been more of a specialized eater, only eating specific foods. And finally, I'll talk about one of my favorite fossils that I've ever found. This is a very special fossil, and it comes with a story. So in 2011, workers in the Canadian oil sands found a nodule of rock within the cliff. In that nodule, sticking out, were some bones, and so they assumed they found a marine reptile given the setting of the oil sands. So they called out for paleontologists to come over, have a look, and then they got the nodule into a cast and tried to pull it out the cliff and lower it down. And unfortunately, the cast did not hold, and the rock dropped and shattered at thousands of pieces. And it took the technician, Mark Mitchell, about 7 years, 6-7 years to put it all back together. And it is now on display in 2017. So this animal is called Boreal pelter, which means northern shield, or shield of the north. And it is really special. It's so exquisitely preserved that we've been able to find out a large amount of information from this one specimen. But we don't have all the time in the world to talk about this as much as I would like to, so I've summarized it here. So the first thing to note is that from that previous picture, the fossil's 3D. That's rare. Most fossils, when they preserve, are either deformed or completely flattened in the preservation. But Boreal pelter is just as how it looked, which is incredible. And this very fine preservation also allowed the preservation of skin impressions, which had fossilized remains of the melanin within the skin, which means people could tell what color it would have been. And so they found a large amount of pheomelanin, which if you look at this diagram here, gives it more of a gingerish color. So it had reddish-brown color tints and was counter-shaded, which allowed it to help hide from the predators in the area, which is incredible. Secondly, the stomach contents were preserved in Boreal pelter, so we were able to see what it last thing it ate before it ended up washed out into the marine environment. And what we found was that it only ate ferns, a specific type of plant, which is a specialized eater, which is incredible. But it also found that the stomach contents had a huge amount of carbon in them, which is odd. You don't normally get a huge amount of carbon specifically in the stomach. And this is because it was eating charcoal, which was indicating that just before it died and had its last meal, there was a forest fire in its environment. And so the fact that we can tell something as specific as a forest fire, which is a roughly 1 week, maybe even 1 month event, from something which is millions of years old, is absolutely phenomenal. And so finally, I just want to kind of go over a few papers which came out either this year or 2022, which really helped our understanding of this group. So a paper from Bristol et al. In 2023 from the University of Bristol, we're starting to look at the skulls of 2 different dinosaurs. One is the Ankylosaur Euoplocephalus, which we talked about earlier, and the other is the Nodosaur Palaeobiology. And what they found is that Euoplocephalus had more stresses in the jaw when it was biting, which meant that it couldn't withstand as many forces compared to the Nodosaur Palaeobiology. And what this means is that it would eat softer food. It couldn't chew as hard. And that Palaeobiology had a more higher amount of mechanical advantage, which meant it could exert more force, which meant that Euoplocephalus was more generally eating plants wherever it could, whereas Palaeobiology was finding a specific kind of plant, which is lining up with what Boreal pelter was showing us, that Nodosaurs generally were more specialized eaters, and Ankylosaurs were more generalist eaters. And so why this is the case is because the Ankylosaurs were preferentiating having more armored skulls compared to the Nodosaurs. You can see in these diagrams, here is Euoplocephalus, and up here is Palaeobiology, and the skull difference is massive. And the reason why is because the Ankylosaurs are trying to get more armored skulls. They're trying to have more defense in their heads. Whereas the Nodosaurs are trying to find more specialist foods to eat. So they're looking for 2 different solutions for their skulls. And finally, just to talk about Zool again, there was a recent study which showed us potential understanding of behavior. So when Victoria Arbour in 2022 was looking at the osteoderm remains of Zools, the bony plates, they found that a few of them on the anterior, on the outside, had been completely shattered and then managed to re-heal, which meant that the animal didn't die, but they took a blow. And so normally when predators attack these osteoderm armors, they tend to get more punctured kind of wounds, more holes, because of the teeth and claws that would dig in and try and pierce through the armor. But these osteoderms were shattered. They were just taking a massive impact. And there was only one other solution this possibly could have been, judging from the angle, only specifically focusing on the outside, these red osteoderms, and being strong enough to damage the bone. It would be another zool, using its tail club to attack each other. This is interesting because it's not unusual for herbivores to do that. We see it, horns and antlers and tusks all used to try and compete with one another. And the most normal reason is because it's two males potentially fighting for mating rights or for territory disputes. But truly, it's hard to say why without actually seeing the animals, which is something we can't do, unfortunately. But it's still incredible to know that despite this fossil being found years before, we're still finding out more information about how these animals could have lived. And that last bit of research has made some amazing paleo art. This is one by Henry Sharp, which is what I used for my introductory slide. And it's two members of zool clashing with each other based on that study. I think this really captures the dynamic and characteristics of Thyreophora dinosaurs. And sadly, that's where my presentation does end. I'd like to thank you all for listening to me ramble on. I could be here all day if I wanted to be, but I'm sure you all have better things to do. But other than that, thank you for listening, and I'll answer any questions.